All right, so this is part 2 of a 3-part lecture series on the Roman world. In part 1, we looked at the Roman Republic, and I asked you some questions and gave you some things to think about in the collapse of the Roman Republic, right? This increasing gap between rich and poor, this sense that the rich and powerful were only interested in themselves and no longer interested in the good of the Republic, and the ultimate collapse of the Republic under the weight of the civil wars that happened between Marius and Sulla, and between Caesar and Pompey, and finally between Octavian and Mark Antony, and how that caused the end of the Roman Republic. Again, keep this all in mind as we now look at the Roman Empire, and ask yourself, how can I use this knowledge as an American citizen to help protect the good of the American Republic and to ensure that it lives on? All right, so first remember your skills. Right? Periodization, what are the differences between periods 1 and 2 of world history? Remember to use your spice factors. And again, I'm just going to present information. You're going to do Cornell notes, and then you want to go back and categorize things according to those spice factors, because that's going to help you with compare and contrast. I might ask you to compare and contrast the Greeks and the Romans, or the Romans and the Chinese. Right? And finally, continuity and change, which is like comparing and contrasting over time. If it's the same from, let's say, period 1 of world history to period 2, it's a continuity. Or if it's the same throughout period 2 of world history, it's a continuity. However, if it changed from one time period, well, then we call that a change. And, the Roman Empire is obviously going through some big changes here. And when we look at Christianity in the next lecture, that's another big change. Right? So first of all here, we're looking at, Rome becoming a much more tolerant empire. Right? To be tolerant means you don't judge people, you're nice to them, you don't really down on the things that they're doing. And empires often must be much more tolerant than kingdoms or republics. Remember that kingdoms and republics, everybody is usually the same ethnic group. They all kind of look the same. They often have the same culture. Empires are created when people take over other people, and they have to be more tolerant because they can't force things on those people that they've conquered, right? And so Rome learned the same lessons as the Persians and the Chinese, which is, if you're going to have a big empire, you're going to have to be much more tolerant, right? The Romans were also less bureaucratic than the Chinese and the Persians. They kind of let people go their own way. They used, they relied more on local control with military garrisons and to maintain ties and control, right? And a garrison, that's like an outpost or a base or a military facility. And the Romans used garrisons to control people rather than, bureaucrats and government structures like that. Right? So remember, Caesar was assassinated, and his nephew Octavian ended up taking over and becoming the first true emperor of Rome. And the Romans never set out to be an empire, so they didn't have a clear succession policy, right? And succession means, who's next, right? Who's the next king? Who's the next emperor? Who's the next president? We have very clear succession guidelines in the United States, right? Every 4 years we elect a president in November, and then in that January right after that, the president is sworn in as the new president or as the continuing president. So we have very clear succession policies, right? Traditionally, it was hereditary, right? In other words, father to son. But the Romans, because they never had a clear sense of themselves as an empire, didn't have that kind of succession policy. They didn't have these hereditary patterns. And so this made assassination very common. And these patterns of civil wars continued. Sometimes they were open civil wars and open assassinations. Sometimes they were hidden and behind the scenes. But no matter what, they were very common. The other problem that the Roman Empire faced was that citizenship citizenship was not available to conquered peoples or slaves. So you had a lot of people living in Rome who were not citizens. And when you start to get to a point where 30, 40, 50% of the people who live in an area aren't full citizens, that's a dangerous position to be in, because those people are not loyal to the country. They've got no reason to behave or be good or help out. So it was another problem that the Roman Empire faced. Right, another was the problems of expansion that Rome faced. And we've got a little animation here to kind of show how quickly Rome grew, right? And so if we think, a lot of you guys are in geometry this year. Some of you are still in algebra. But, even if you've done like pre-algebra, you know how to find the perimeter of a circle, right? So you want to consider the the borders of the Roman Empire as an expanding circle that had to be controlled, right? And so if every unit of perimeter, whether we're talking about miles or kilometers, etc., has a set cost, as in it's going to cost you so many dollars to control a mile of your border, it's going to cost you so much money to control a mile of the line between you and your enemies, you can see how these costs are going to rise very quickly. We're coming up again on the start of the GIF here. And again, I just want you to look at that as well as the little graph here. You can see that those costs rise very, very quickly, right? So, there's the end of the Roman Empire in the 1400s. I guess it didn't loop. But let's continue on. Right, and so those, like I said, those problems of expansion, right? Borders cost money to defend. And here we see an example of a garrison, right? This is the very famous Hadrian's Wall, named after the Emperor Hadrian, who ordered it built. He didn't do the work himself. Right, this was a wall that the Romans put up basically to divide England from Scotland and keep those vicious Scots out. But these things cost money. You got to pay the soldiers, you got to pay for weapons, you got to pay for upkeep. And you got to remember that Rome had a professional army, and many of those people weren't even citizens. So, you've got these border garrisons. Sometimes the soldiers in those garrisons are more closely related to the people they're defending against than the Romans themselves. Sometimes they're conquered people who would love nothing more than see Rome fall apart. And so Rome's borders were very, very open. They were well defended militarily, but very, very vulnerable, right? The other thing you got to keep in mind is that as the empire expanded, it cost a lot of money to move things around. And the Romans built great roads. I mean, this picture here on the bottom is the so-called Appian Way, which is still used today in Rome. I mean, still you see cars and carts drawn by oxen going down the Appian Way. Wonderful roads, but they still cost a lot of money. And the bigger it gets, the more expensive it gets, right? And like I said, some ethnic groups, notably groups like the Jews, but also some of the German and Slavic groups to the north, were very hard to control. They didn't want to be a part of the Roman Empire, so they constantly had to be kept in line with violence and threats. And you can see how that would make the empire very unstable. Now, during the imperial period, not everything was bad. From 96 to 180 CE, and you got to remember here, right, Julius Caesar died in 44 BCE, is the death of Caesar and really the beginning of the Roman Empire. From 96 to 180 CE, Rome reached the height of its political power and goodness and territory under the 5 good emperors. Right, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, who I talked about a moment ago, very famous for expanding the empire, and then Marcus Aurelius, right? And if you're familiar with the movie Gladiator, that's that emperor, Marcus Aurelius. And the thing about these emperors, they all picked their own successors. So they had a clear succession line during that period. They grew the empire. There's a little typo there, right? They dealt fairly and sensibly with laws and the government and their citizens. And this was really a good period for the Roman Empire where it looked like, okay, maybe this empire thing can work. But then, things decline, right? After the death of Marcus Aurelius, the empire continued on for between 250 and 1300 years. I realize that's a wide range of dates. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But, let's take the low number here, that 250-year period, again, just back into chaos, right? The period from Caesar's death to, the time of the great emperors, that was a really rocky time too. That's the time of Nero and Caligula and some of these other really nasty emperors who were really evil people. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the Christianity lecture as well. But really, the period after Aurelius, things are starting to fall apart. The costs, the citizenship, slavery, transportation, lots of stuff. You want to keep in mind that these next few slides are going to cover the 250-year version in very broad themes and trends, right? So I'm doing, what we might call a trends and forces thing here, where it's not so much about the people and dates. It's about the trends and the currents and the direction things are going in. So I want you to keep that in mind, is that we're just looking at the big trends here, not specific facts. So focus on the big picture, right? Again, you've got this professional army, especially the emperor's Praetorian Guard, who are the elite soldiers of the Roman Empire. They begin to control the succession of emperors, and they would just kill emperors who didn't follow directions. I mean, you literally get emperors who are only on the throne for months. I mean, you can imagine like getting a new president every 6 months, but this is an emperor. He doesn't even really have to follow the laws. These guys are getting wiped out right and left. I mean, you're much safer as a Roman soldier fighting the Germans than you are as a Roman emperor at some points. We also, get the continued expansion of slavery, right? The rich people and the powerful people want slaves, but what happens is low-skilled Romans and Romans without a lot of power, they start being put out of work, right? A slave is a whole lot cheaper than paying someone, and so they go on to the dole, which is the Roman form of welfare and food stamps. So you have more slaves. The slaves don't pay taxes. You have less people working, so they're paying less taxes. And those people who are not working and paying taxes, they need free food and stuff from the government, so they're, becoming desperate. You get ethnic groups like Jews and Christians who are revolting against the government and actively working against the government. You start to get these nasty, disgusting gladiator games, which, I love the movie Gladiator and stuff like that, but I mean, you've got people going and sitting in a stadium watching people get killed and fed to animals. I mean, that's just disgusting behavior. And the emperors are doing this because it's a way to distract people from their problems. And does that sound American, right? Big, violent spectacles, people getting wasted, just, watching violent spectacles to take their mind off the problems in front of them. I don't know if that has anything to do with us, right? And finally, diseases brought from trade with the East. I mean, you start people getting really sick and population declines. I mean, lots of bad stuff happening. And so finally, Rome is just weak. And in 476, a man named Odoacer led a group of Germanic Roman soldiers into the city of Rome and deposed the last Roman emperor. Right? Deposed is a fancy word, meaning they just kicked him out. Or kicked off the throne. Kicked off the throne or kicked out. The last Roman emperor, making this the end of what the historians call the Western Roman Empire. And I'm going to talk about the Eastern Roman Empire in a moment. But it's important to note here, right, that Odoacer, they worked for Rome. These soldiers that he led, Roman equipment, Roman training. But they're not Romans, and they're not citizens, and they're outsiders, and they're sick of it. And, Rome is a great place to go burn and pillage and take stuff. So, interesting challenges here. right? And so you've heard me kind of hint at this, right? But there were other Roman empires, right? In the early 300s CE, right, after the time of Marcus Aurelius and the good emperors, the Roman Empire splits into an eastern and a western half. And this was done deliberately. You know, they kind of realized, well, this thing is getting too big to control by ourselves. You know, so they split it here, obviously, where the color is, right? And the eastern capital is at Constantinople. Of course, the western capital is at Rome. In 330, Constantine the Great, who I'm going to talk about in the Christianity lecture, moved the capital of the entire empire to Constantinople. But then, you know, the main capital was moved back to Rome. Right, and so throughout the 300s, the two halves would split, and you'd have this more Hellenized eastern half. You know, and we know what the word Hellenized means. It means it's more aligned with Greek culture. And eventually that would evolve into what would become known as the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire would last until the defeat by the Ottoman Turks in the 1400s. So that's why I say, you know, we might think that the Roman Empire lasted for another 1200 years. People who are really interested in Eastern history and the history of the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Turks and the rise of Russia and the origins of Ukraine and things like that, they tend to talk about the importance of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they say, no, Rome lasted for another 1,200 years, whereas Europeans, the English, the Americans, the French, they tend to say, well, no, the Roman Empire fell in the 400s. So a matter of some argument there. It depends on what you mean when you say the Roman Empire. You know, but even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, you know, Rome doesn't necessarily fall, right? When we talk about the medieval period, and the medieval period roughly is like 1000 CE to 1400 CE. I'll give you more specific dates when we start studying that time period, but this is the broad window there. During the medieval period, you know, the Holy Roman Empire was created, and it actually wasn't based in Rome at all. It was up in like Germany and France, but you know, they were trying to resurrect this idea of a Roman Empire. The terms Tsar or Tsar, you know, the Russian rulers, and the word Kaiser, which was the Germans' name for their ruler, these are translations of Caesar, right? It's a direct translation. In fact, Hitler called his movement the Third Reich, and the Reich just means the reign, right? And it was Hitler's theory that the first two reigns, or Reichs, were Rome and the Holy Roman Empire, you know, and so that he would be the Third Reich, and that would be actually the final Reich. And it's kind of interesting, too, you know, the United States continues to use a lot of the imagery of Rome, the eagle that you see, especially at the top of our flag, you know, harkens back to the eagles that were on top of Roman battle standards. And our founders modeled the USA on the Roman Republic, especially our Constitution and our laws and the way our government's set up. So, you know, the Roman Empire still continues to have a very big influence on the West and on the way we live today. So there are a lot of, you know, kind of continuities, cultural and political continuities that stretch back to the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And so that's it for part 2, the Roman Empire. In part 3, we're going to look at the origins of Christianity within the Roman Empire. Thanks for watching.